What if the quietest house in Manhattan, one that had forgotten the sound of laughter, could be brought back to life by the hands of a poor maid and the fragile smile of a child? If this story touches your heart, please subscribe so you never miss the rest of this healing journey. The mansion on East 72nd Street stood like a mausoleum of forgotten music. Its limestone walls had been polished by time and rain, its tall windows shrouded in heavy curtains, and its iron gates rarely swung open for visitors. Once, the home had been alive with gatherings, filled with laughter and the lingering brilliance of piano concertos that spilled out into the night air. But those days had vanished with the passing of one woman, Margaret Hayes, a pianist whose music had made the mansion feel like a living instrument of light. Now, silence ruled. Edward Hayes, her husband, lived within those cavernous walls as though they were both fortress and prison. At 42, he still cut the figure of a man in command, tall, angular, with eyes that carried the weight of Manhattan's financial skyline. As CEO of Hayes Capital, he had the world at his fingertips. Yet his heart, hollowed by grief, had retreated deep into the shadows. He rarely spoke more than a handful of words a day, and to his daughter Clara, only 5 years old, he offered presents without warmth. Clara had been a child of laughter once. Margaret used to lift her onto the bench of the grand piano in the drawing room, placing tiny fingers on ivory keys, teaching her to follow the melody. But after Margaret's final breath slipped away in a hospital room at Memorial Sloan Kettering, Clara's voice slipped away too. No one could coax a word from her, not doctors, not teachers, not even her father. She had retreated into silence, a mirror of the mansion itself. That spring morning, a new figure entered the gates. Isabella Morales walked with small, measured steps, her shoes worn from miles of city sidewalks, her uniform neatly pressed though it was second-hand. At 22, she was far too young to bear the burdens that had bent her back. The loss of her father, the poverty of her upbringing in the Bronx, the endless nights working odd jobs to cover her mother's medicine. She had come not by ambition but necessity, answering the posting for domestic help at the Hayes mansion. When the butler, Mr. Rowe, opened the door, Isabella was struck by the chill that drifted from the marble halls. Even the air seemed afraid to echo. "You'll be in charge of light duties," Rowe muttered. "Dusting, cleaning, assisting with meals. Stay out of the master's way. He doesn't like disturbance." She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." Her eyes wandered, though, to the piano in the drawing room. Covered in a pale cloth, it looked more like a coffin than an instrument. She longed to brush the keys, to feel again what she had once studied in borrowed practice rooms at the community center, before dreams of Juilliard had dissolved under the weight of unpaid bills. Clara sat nearby. The little girl wore a pale dress that hung loose on her shoulders, her hair neatly brushed, but her eyes vacant, as though she were staring at something only she could see. She clutched a small stuffed rabbit to her chest. When Isabella greeted her softly, "Hello, sweetheart," Clara did not respond. Not even a blink. Isabella's chest tightened. She recognized the look, the silent weight of grief. It was the same look she had carried the day her own father was lowered into the earth. The hours slipped into evening. Isabella worked quietly, dusting shelves lined with forgotten books, polishing frames that still held photographs of Margaret. She passed Edward in the hall once. He strode by in a tailored suit, phone pressed to his ear, his face a stone mask of strategy. He didn't seem to notice the young maid at all. Yet later, when she carried a basket of linens past the drawing room, something pulled her in. Clara was there again, sitting beside the piano, staring at it as though it were a locked door. Isabella hesitated. Then, setting the basket down, she lifted a corner of the cloth from the instrument. Her fingers trembling brushed a single key. A sound emerged, a note, fragile, imperfect, but alive. Clara's head turned. For the first time, their eyes met. The girl's gaze was wary, questioning but not empty. She shifted slightly on the bench, almost inviting. Isabella sat down carefully beside her, her heart beating like a drum in her chest. She pressed another key, then another, piecing together the bare bones of a lullaby her mother used to hum while washing dishes late into the night. The melody lingered in the air, and Clara's eyes softened. A shadow stirred in the doorway. Edward had returned home earlier than expected. He stood there, briefcase in hand, frozen. The sight of Isabella's hands on the piano, his wife's piano, hit him like a blow. Memories surged, Margaret's fingers dancing on the keys, her laughter filling the room. His throat constricted, grief clawing at him. Without a word, he turned away, retreating into silence once more. But Clara remained. She reached out, tentatively, trembling, and placed her small hand atop Isabella's. Together, they pressed a note, then another, and for the first time in months, the corners of Clara's lips curved upward in something that resembled a smile. Isabella swallowed hard. She had not come here to change lives, only to survive. Yet something told her that the mansion she had stepped into was not just a place of employment, it was a place of destiny. The night deepened. The house, still cloaked in grief, seemed to listen. And within its walls, a fragile thread had been tied, between a silent child, a grieving father, and a maid who still carried music in her veins. The following morning dawned pale over Manhattan. The city outside the tall windows of the Hayes mansion woke with its usual thunder of taxis and delivery trucks. Yet inside the limestone walls, silence lingered like a heavy fog. Isabella moved through her new routine with quiet diligence. She rose early, preparing the drawing room before the family stirred. The house itself seemed to resist change. The dust crept back quickly, and the corridors swallowed sound as though every laugh or whisper were a trespass against its grief. Still, Isabella polished the marble, opened curtains to let hesitant light fall through, and whispered good morning to a child who never replied. Clara sat in her usual place. The girl had stationed herself by the grand piano once more, as though it were a shrine. Her rabbit doll rested in her lap, its ears worn thin by the constant grasp of small fingers. Her gaze was fixed on the covered instrument, but her face remained blank until Isabella entered. That was when something shifted. Clara's eyes followed her, not with words, not with smiles, but with a searching stillness, as though measuring if the previous evening's fragile connection might return. Isabella set her cleaning cloth aside. "Would you like to hear something again?" she asked softly, though she knew the girl would not answer. The silence pressed back, but it no longer frightened her. Instead, she lifted the cloth from the piano and sat down at the bench. This time she chose a children's song, simple and playful, one she had once taught neighborhood kids at the community center. Her fingers stumbled at first. The keys were slightly out of tune from neglect, but soon the melody carried her forward. Clara blinked. Then she slid from her chair and climbed onto the bench beside Isabella without a sound. Their shoulders brushed. Isabella's breath caught, and she adjusted her hands so that the girl could press a key if she wished. Tentatively, Clara extended one small finger and tapped the ivory. The note rang, hesitant but clear. Isabella smiled. "Perfect," she whispered. "That's exactly right." For a moment, the room transformed. The dust, the shadows, the grief etched into the mansion's walls, everything softened beneath the fragile duet of maid and child. From the hallway, Edward Hayes paused unseen. He had been on his way to his study, phone in hand, mind already racing through figures and contracts. But the sound of music stopped him. He stood by the archway, hidden in shadow, and watched. His daughter leaned against the young maid, pressing keys with shy determination. Isabella guided her with patience, her face lit by a tenderness that unsettled Edward. It had been months, long, brutal months, since he had seen Clara's features soften into anything close to joy. And yet, here she was, leaning toward this stranger as though she had been waiting for her all along. Edward's chest tightened. A rush of memory struck him. Margaret's laughter on summer evenings, Clara giggling as she slapped random keys while her mother pretended to conduct a symphony. He turned away abruptly, unable to bear the sting of longing that memory carried. His footsteps retreated down the hall, but his thoughts refused to follow. Inside, Clara pressed another note. She tilted her head toward Isabella with the faintest flicker of expectation, as if asking silently, "Is this right?" "It's beautiful," Isabella assured her. "Every note you play is a little light." The girl's lips parted slightly. Not a word yet, but the first sign of breath against silence. Isabella's heart lifted. She knew this was not simply play. This was communication. Music was giving Clara a voice where words had failed. The lesson continued until the clock chimed noon. Clara did not move from the bench. Even when Roe entered to announce lunch, she clung to the piano, her small hands reluctant to leave the keys. Isabella glanced at him nervously, expecting reproach, but the butler only raised an eyebrow. Perhaps, she thought, even he recognized the rarity of this moment. At the table, Edward barely touched his meal. Clara sat beside him, still clutching her rabbit, her fingers twitching as if replaying the piano keys in her mind. Isabella served quietly, but her presence was not lost on Edward. Every so often his gaze flickered toward her, his expression unreadable. When lunch ended, Edward excused himself, returning to the fortress of his office. Clara followed Isabella back to the drawing room. Without prompting, the girl placed the rabbit on the bench and touched the piano again. Isabella laughed softly. "All right then, another song." Hours passed. The maid's duties fell behind schedule, but something more important unfolded: a fragile friendship. Clara never spoke, but she leaned closer, allowed Isabella to guide her tiny hands, even smiled once. A faint curve, but real. By evening, the mansion had changed. It was still solemn, but a thread of melody wound through its halls, weaving cracks in the silence. Even Roe, carrying a tray past the drawing room, paused briefly to listen. His lined face softened, though he would never admit it aloud. That night, as Isabella prepared to leave, Clara surprised her. The girl reached for her sleeve, holding it gently between her fingers, as if to say, "Stay." Isabella knelt. "I'll be here tomorrow, Clara. I promise." The child released her and hugged the rabbit tight. Upstairs, Edward stood by the window of his private chamber. Manhattan's skyline glittered like a crown, but he barely noticed. His thoughts replayed the scene he had witnessed. Clara beside the piano, guided by a stranger's hands. A flicker of warmth had entered her face, something he had failed to summon in months. He whispered to the empty room, "Margaret, what am I supposed to do?" But there was no answer, only the faint memory of music. And so the mansion, still silent, still aching, began to hum with a quiet shift. For in the heart of grief, two souls, one child and one young woman, had found each other beside the piano and, unknowingly, had begun to draw Edward back into life. The days that followed unfolded like hesitant notes on a score, fragile, uneven, yet undeniably alive. Clara's routine began to change. Instead of wandering the corridors with her rabbit in silence, she made her way each morning to the piano bench, where Isabella waited. The maid's hands smelled faintly of soap and lemon polish, but when they touched the keys, something brighter emerged, music that coaxed life from shadows. At first, Isabella only played simple scales, letting Clara tap one note here and another there. But slowly, deliberately, she began to weave patterns, tiny melodies built of patience and trust. Clara leaned closer each day, her small hands mimicking Isabella's movements with growing courage. On the fourth morning, Edward entered the drawing room unannounced. He had come down earlier than usual, a restless night having left him weary of the prison of his office. The sound of music drew him forward. There, before him, Clara pressed a sequence of 3 hesitant notes. Isabella guided her with gentle whispers. "Try this one, Clara. Yes, that's it. Now one more." The girl struck another key. The combination, uneven though it was, carried the outline of a melody. Edward froze. For months, he had endured only silence from his daughter. Now, here she was, producing sound. Not words, not laughter, but something just as profound. He stepped forward before he realized it. The floor creaked. Isabella's hands fell still on the keys. Clara's head whipped around, her eyes wide, almost guilty. Edward's throat tightened. What are you doing?" His voice sounded harsher than he intended. Isabella rose quickly from the bench, her face flushed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. I shouldn't have—" But before she could finish, Clara tugged her sleeve, pulling her back down onto the bench. The little girl pressed another note defiantly, as though begging her father to understand. Edward stared. The sight tore through his defenses. It was Margaret he saw, the way she had once leaned over Clara's shoulder, guiding small fingers across ivory. His chest ached as though grief itself had struck a chord inside him. "Continue," he whispered hoarsely. "Please." Isabella hesitated, then nodded. She resumed, playing a slow progression of notes while Clara added her hesitant accents. The melody, broken and halting, grew into something recognizable. A lullaby Isabella's mother used to sing in Spanish, one she had adapted for the piano. Edward lowered himself into a chair, unable to look away. His hands trembled against his knees. The sound of music filled the room again, and for the first time in years, the mansion did not feel like a tomb. When the piece ended, Isabella turned toward Clara. "You played beautifully." Clara's lips parted. A sound escaped. Not a word, not yet, but a soft hum that matched the final note. Edward heard it, and tears stung his eyes. He stood abruptly, muttered something about a meeting, and left the room before either could see his face. That evening, Edward retreated to his study. He poured himself a glass of scotch and stood before the framed photograph of Margaret on the piano inside the room. She smiled at him from across time, her dark hair swept back, her eyes alive with fire. "Margaret," he whispered, "what would you think of this?" He closed his eyes. The echo of Isabella's lullaby lingered in his ears. It was not Margaret's playing, but there was something hauntingly familiar in the way Isabella coaxed music into life. An honesty, an absence of ego, the same kind of devotion Margaret had once given. Edward clenched his glass. The guilt pressed heavier. Was it betrayal to let another's music into their home? To allow his daughter to bond with someone who reminded him too much of the woman he lost? And yet, he had seen Clara's eyes brighten. He had seen her touch the keys without fear. He had heard her hum. Could he truly deny his daughter that flicker of life simply to protect his grief? Meanwhile, in the small room assigned to her at the far end of the servants' wing, Isabella sat on the edge of her narrow bed, clutching a worn photograph of her own mother. The older woman's smile was weary, yet filled with love. Beside the photo lay Isabella's tattered notebook, filled with musical sketches she had written as a teenager when Juilliard still seemed within reach. She had promised herself never to dream again. Dreams cost too much. They ended in disappointment, in empty bank accounts, in her mother's trembling hands asking for medicine they could barely afford. But Clara's eyes haunted her. That silent plea, the way the child pressed notes with tentative hope, it stirred something Isabella had buried. Perhaps, she thought, music could still matter. Not for herself, but for Clara. The next morning, Edward lingered near the drawing room once more. He told himself he was simply passing through, but when Isabella and Clara sat at the piano, he found his steps slowing, his ears straining for every note. "Would you like to learn a real song today?" Isabella asked gently. Clara's head lifted. She didn't speak, but her eyes shone. Isabella played a simple melody, just a handful of notes, repeated in a pattern. She guided Clara's small hands across the keys. Slowly, haltingly, the child repeated the sequence. The room filled with something miraculous. Clara's first melody. Edward's heart lurched. His hand gripped the doorway as if to steady himself. A single line of music, uneven and fragile, but entirely hers. Isabella clapped softly. "You did it, Clara." The girl turned to her father as if seeking his approval. Edward stepped into the room. His throat felt raw. For a long moment he could not speak. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "Margaret would be proud." Isabella's eyes softened. Clara tilted her head, and for the first time she smiled directly at her father. The melody lingered in the air, more powerful than words. It was not just Clara's first song. It was the first fragile bridge across the chasm of grief that separated father and daughter. And Edward knew, though he did not yet say it aloud, that the maid who had entered his home out of necessity had begun to change everything. The summer storm arrived without warning. By late afternoon, clouds had rolled across Manhattan like a dark tide. The tall windows of the Hayes mansion rattled against gusts of wind. The air turned heavy, as if the city itself held its breath. Edward sat in his study, papers spread across the mahogany desk, though he had not read a line in hours. He kept replaying the melody his daughter had managed to stumble through that morning, Clara's first fragile tune. It should have been a balm. Instead, it stirred unease. Music, once the heartbeat of this house, had become a ghost he could neither banish nor embrace. And it was Isabella, this young woman who should have been invisible within his household, who had conjured it back. Thunder cracked overhead. Edward started, then frowned when he thought he heard footsteps rushing across the upstairs corridor. Before he could rise, a frantic knock rattled the door. "Mr. Hayes!" It was Roe, his voice tight. "It's Clara!" Edward was out of his chair instantly. He found his daughter in her room, flushed and trembling beneath damp sheets. Isabella knelt beside the bed, wringing out a cold cloth to press against Clara's forehead. The child's face was pale, except for the fever's bloom of red across her cheeks. Her small body shivered, though sweat clung to her skin. "She's burning up," Isabella said quickly, glancing up. I think it came on suddenly. She was fine at lunch." Edward crossed the room in 3 long strides and pressed his palm against Clara's forehead. The heat shot panic through him. "Call Dr. Hammond," he ordered. His voice shook more than he wanted. Roe hurried off. Edward hovered helplessly, watching Clara's eyelids flutter. Her lips moved, soundless, as though caught between dream and delirium. Edward felt the storm outside mirrored within his chest. He had built empires, commanded rooms of men with billions at stake, yet in the face of his daughter's fever, he was powerless. Isabella dipped the cloth again, her hands steady though her own heart pounded. "She needs the hospital," she murmured. "Now." Edward hesitated only a second. Then he scooped Clara into his arms. The child whimpered, clutching her rabbit against her chest. He had carried her like this once before, 5 years ago, when she was still small enough to rest her head beneath Margaret's chin. The memory nearly broke him. "Car's out front," Roe announced. "Driver's ready." They hurried down marble stairs, lightning flashing through tall windows. Rain hammered the pavement as Edward carried Clara into the waiting town car. Isabella slid in beside him, holding the girl's damp hand the whole ride to New York Presbyterian Hospital. The emergency room smelled of antiseptic and worry. Nurses rushed Clara into an exam room, taking her temperature, attaching monitors, threading an IV into her tiny arm. Edward stood frozen by the doorway, his expensive suit soaked at the shoulders. "She'll be all right, won't she?" he demanded of no one in particular. "We'll do everything we can," the nurse said, already focused on machines. Isabella touched his sleeve. "She's strong. Just stay with her." It was the first time anyone had spoken to him like that since Margaret died. Not as CEO, not as client, but as father. Edward swallowed hard and nodded. Hours blurred. Rain streaked the hospital windows, thunder fading into a dull rumble. Edward sat beside Clara's bed, his hand engulfing hers. Isabella never left the other side, adjusting blankets, humming soft melodies under her breath. Sometime past midnight, Clara stirred. Her eyes opened, glassy but searching. Her lips trembled. Edward leaned close. "Clara, I'm here." Her mouth opened. And then, like a crack of light through a storm cloud, her voice emerged. "Daddy." The word was faint, broken, but it struck Edward with the force of thunder. His eyes flooded. He pressed his forehead against her small hand, choking back sobs. Months of silence shattered in a single syllable. Isabella covered her mouth, tears streaming. She had not known what would come, but hearing Clara speak at last felt like witnessing a miracle. Edward clung to his daughter. "I'm here, sweetheart. I won't leave. I promise." By morning, Clara's fever broke. The doctor assured them it had been a viral infection, intense but short-lived. Relief swept through Edward like a tide. He had faced boardrooms filled with enemies, markets on the verge of collapse, but nothing compared to the terror of nearly losing Clara again. When they returned to the mansion, the storm had passed. Sunlight broke through dripping branches along East 72nd Street. Edward carried Clara upstairs himself, tucking her into bed with uncharacteristic gentleness. Isabella lingered in the doorway, exhaustion etched across her face. Edward turned toward her. For a moment, words failed him. He had not thanked anyone in years. Finally, his voice came low and rough. "You saved her?" Isabella shook her head quickly. "No, sir. Clara saved herself. She's stronger than she looks." But Edward caught the tremor in her voice. He saw the devotion in the way she smoothed the blanket at Clara's side. And something inside him shifted. For the first time, he recognized not just a servant, but a young woman who had stood unflinching in the storm, carrying his daughter when he could not. "Still," he said, softer now, "I owe you more than I can say." Their eyes met, his heavy with gratitude, hers glistening with unspoken longing. Then Clara sighed in her sleep, and the spell broke. Edward stepped back, retreating into his usual armor of silence. But in his chest, something had cracked open. The mansion would never again be quite as silent. That evening, Edward stood once more in the drawing room. The piano gleamed faintly in the dusk light, its cover still folded back from Clara's last lesson. Slowly, hesitantly, Edward laid a hand on the keys. He had never played, never dared. That had been Margaret's world. But tonight he pressed one note. It rang clear. And in that sound, he felt the echo of his daughter's voice. "Daddy," breaking through silence like dawn through storm. The mansion no longer felt quite the same. It was subtle at first, the way sunlight seemed to linger longer in the drawing room, the way Clara's small footsteps no longer echoed with such emptiness, the way Edward's eyes, though still shadowed, softened when they rested on his daughter. Something had shifted since the night of the storm. A silence had broken. Clara now followed Isabella like a shadow. She rose early just to meet her by the piano, rabbit tucked under one arm, eyes glimmering with an eagerness that had not been there for months. She pressed the keys with growing confidence, her little hums gradually forming into tentative words. Sometimes, again, sometimes, please. For Edward, every syllable was a miracle. One evening, Isabella chose to play something different. Instead of the simple scales and lullabies, she lifted her hands and began the opening chords of a piece she had once promised herself never to play again. A composition written by Margaret Hayes long ago when she was a student at Juilliard. The melody was unlike anything Clara had learned before. It was haunting, elegant, threaded with both joy and melancholy. Isabella's fingers trembled as she shaped each phrase. She had discovered the handwritten sheet tucked inside a drawer while dusting, unable to resist the urge to breathe life into it again. Clara tilted her head, sensing the weight of the music. She pressed a few hesitant notes to accompany Isabella, though she could not keep pace. Still, she tried. Edward entered just as the melody swelled. He froze in the doorway. His breath left him in a shudder. That song, he knew it instantly. Margaret had played it in the final months before her illness, whispering it was her gift to the future. He had not heard it since the day she died. The sight before him nearly undid him. Isabella, a stranger, her brown hands coaxing Margaret's music from the piano, while Clara leaned close, eyes wide and trusting. "Stop," Edward croaked. Isabella's fingers faltered to silence. She turned, alarm flashing across her face. Clara glanced at her father, fear flickering in her eyes. Edward stepped forward, voice thick. Where did you find that?" "In the drawer, sir," Isabella whispered. "I'm sorry. I thought—" But Clara tugged her sleeve, insistent, pressing a key as if begging the melody to continue. Her lips parted, and for the first time she said it aloud. "Play." The single word pierced Edward like an arrow. Clara had spoken, truly spoken, and it was not to him, but to Isabella. He staggered back, torn between anguish and awe. His wife's music, his daughter's first word in months, and the hands of a maid binding them together, it was too much. His chest heaved. For a moment he nearly fled. But then Clara looked at him, really looked. Her eyes, still childlike yet shadowed by loss, held a silent plea. "Stay." Edward's legs weakened. He sank into a chair. "Go on," he whispered. So Isabella began again. Her fingers moved slowly, reverently. Clara pressed keys in scattered accompaniment, giggling softly at her mistakes. Edward's vision blurred as tears welled. He had not allowed himself to cry since Margaret's funeral. Now the flood broke free. He bowed his head, shoulders shaking, silent sobs echoing against the music. Then, something astonishing happened. Clara slipped off the bench and walked to him. With small, trembling hands, she reached for his. Edward looked up through tears, bewildered. Clara pressed her palm into his, then curled her fingers around his own. For the first time in so long, he felt the warmth of her hand in his. Small, fragile, but alive. Edward choked a laugh through his tears. He squeezed her hand back, holding it tightly as though he might never let go. "I'm here," he whispered. "Daddy's here." Clara smiled, faint but true. and Isabella, watching from the bench, pressed her lips together to hold back her own tears. Later that night, after Clara had fallen asleep with her rabbit tucked close, Edward lingered in the drawing room. Isabella was tidying the music sheets when he entered quietly. "You played beautifully," he said, his voice raw but sincere. Isabella froze. "I'm sorry if I overstepped. I shouldn't have touched her music without permission." Edward shook his head. "No. Margaret would have wanted it heard. That was her legacy. For Clara, and for me." He paused, then added almost to himself, "I'd forgotten how much life there is in music." "You reminded me." Isabella lowered her gaze. "It's Clara, sir. She carries her mother's gift." Edward studied her. "And you've given her the courage to use it." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Not the heavy silence of grief, but something gentler, filled with possibility. Finally, Edward exhaled. "Thank you, Isabella. Not just for tonight. For everything." She swallowed hard, nodding. "It's what anyone would do." But they both knew that wasn't true. The following days blossomed with change. Clara began to speak in short bursts. "Yes. No. Play. Daddy." Each word felt like a jewel to Edward. Precious and hard-won. He spent more time at home, often standing quietly in the doorway while Clara and Isabella played. Sometimes he even sat beside them, one hand resting protectively on Clara's back as the music carried them forward. The mansion, once frozen in mourning, now trembled with awakening. Roe, the butler, noticed it too. He found himself pausing more often outside the drawing room, listening to the laughter that had returned. Even the maids smiled more, as though the house itself had exhaled. One evening, Edward caught sight of a sketch Clara had left on the table. Crayon lines depicted 3 figures: a tall man, a little girl, and beside them, a young woman with long dark hair. Above their heads, Clara had drawn a piano. Edward's heart ached as he traced the crude lines with his finger. "A family," his daughter seemed to say. "Not 2, but 3. He folded the drawing carefully and placed it inside his wallet. But even as hope bloomed, Edward could not silence the gnawing guilt. Margaret's memory lingered in every chord. Could he allow himself to embrace this fragile new bond without betraying the woman he had loved? Could he open the door to Isabella's presence in their lives when her music mirrored Margaret's so closely? He didn't yet know the answer. But as he stood in the doorway one evening, watching Clara press a melody of her own invention, Edward felt something stir within him, something he had thought long buried. It was the faint, undeniable sound of his own heart awakening. The days of late summer unfurled gently, threaded with music. Clara's voice, once locked away, now appeared in small fragments. "Daddy, again. Please." Each word felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. For Edward, every syllable was a gift. For Isabella, every note Clara struck was a reminder of the dreams she had once buried. One afternoon, while Clara napped, Edward returned early from the office. The mansion was unusually quiet. He wandered down the long hall, his footsteps echoing faintly, until he reached the drawing room. The piano sat uncovered, a sheet of handwritten music resting on its stand. He leaned closer. The handwriting wasn't Margaret's. It was Isabella's. Her letters were careful but slightly curved, the notes arranged with the precision of someone who understood theory deeply. Edward frowned, intrigued. Before he could study further, a soft voice spoke behind him. "That was mine." He turned. Isabella stood at the doorway, clutching a stack of linens to her chest. eyes wide as though she had been caught trespassing. Edward held up the paper. "You wrote this?" Her lips pressed together, then she nodded. "A long time ago. Before everything." Edward gestured for her to continue. "I studied piano for years," she said quietly. "I had a teacher at the community center in the Bronx. He believed I could go far. I applied to Juilliard when I was 17. I even passed the first auditions." Her eyes glistened. "But my mother got sick. She needed care, and I couldn't leave her alone. Tuition, medicine, it was impossible. So I stopped playing. At least, until Clara." She looked away, ashamed, as though revealing this was some weakness. Edward was silent. He had built fortunes, brokered deals that shifted markets, but he had never stood in awe of courage until that moment. This young woman had surrendered her dream not from failure, but from love. "And now?" he asked softly. Isabella smiled sadly. "Now my dream lives in her." As if summoned, Clara appeared at the doorway, rubbing her eyes from sleep. She toddled toward Isabella and wrapped an arm around her waist. Then, in a trembling voice, she whispered, "Don't stop. Play." Edward's chest constricted. It was the clearest sentence Clara had spoken since Margaret's death. Isabella froze, eyes wide with shock, before she knelt to embrace the child. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Edward stood transfixed. His daughter had not only spoken, but had spoken to keep Isabella's dream alive. In that moment, he realized something he had resisted admitting. Clara needed Isabella as much as she needed him, and perhaps he too needed her. Later that evening, Edward found himself outside Isabella's small room at the end of the servants' corridor. He hesitated before knocking. When she opened the door, surprise flickered across her face. "I wanted to thank you," he said, awkward, unused to such vulnerability, "for what you've given Clara, and for what you gave up." Isabella shook her head. "I don't want your pity." "It isn't pity," Edward replied firmly. "It's respect." For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Then Clara's laughter drifted down the hall from her nanny's room. Light, unguarded, the laughter of a child who had found a voice again. Edward exhaled. "I lost my wife to illness. You nearly lost your future to it. But perhaps—" He hesitated, struggling for words. "Perhaps neither of you is truly lost. Not while Clara carries both your songs." Isabella's eyes shimmered. She pressed a hand to her chest as though steadying her heart. The following week, Isabella returned to the piano with renewed energy. She taught Clara not only notes but rhythm, guiding her through exercises with gentle claps of her hands. Clara's progress astonished Edward. In less than 2 months, she moved from silence to melodies, her fingers stumbling but determined. One evening, Clara surprised them both. After finishing a simple song, she leaned against Isabella and whispered, "Sister." The word was soft, but undeniable. Edward's throat tightened. He had worried Clara would see Isabella as a stranger intruding on Margaret's memory. Instead, Clara had claimed her as family. Isabella hugged the girl tightly, tears shining in her eyes. But when her gaze met Edward's, she quickly looked away, as if afraid of what lay behind his expression. That night, Edward stood once more in the drawing room, alone. He touched the piano gently, recalling Margaret's hands, then Isabella's. The notes of both women seemed to intertwine in his memory, not erasing one another, but harmonizing. For the first time, he considered what it might mean to let the past and present coexist, to honor Margaret while embracing the fragile, unexpected gift standing before him in the form of Isabella. He pressed one key, then another. The sound echoed into the dark halls. And for once the mansion did not feel haunted. It felt alive. But Edward's mind remained restless. He knew the world outside their walls would not easily understand. To society, Isabella was a maid, a girl from the Bronx with no pedigree. To his board of directors, she would be an inconvenience, a distraction. To his own guarded heart, she was dangerous, because she reminded him of the possibility of living again. Still, as he lay awake that night, he could not silence Clara's trembling words. "Don't stop. Play." Perhaps, he thought, this was not only Clara's plea. Perhaps it was also Margaret's, and perhaps it was his own. The Hayes mansion had begun to breathe again. It wasn't only the music echoing in the drawing room, it was the rhythm of life seeping back into every corner. Clara, once a ghostly child wandering silent halls, now laughed in soft bursts, short and fragile but real. She no longer lingered alone by the piano but carried her rabbit in one hand and Isabella's fingers in the other. Wherever Isabella went, polishing silver, arranging flowers, folding linens, Clara followed, like a younger sister desperate never to be left behind. Edward noticed everything. He noticed the way Clara's eyes brightened when Isabella entered the room. He noticed the way the girl leaned against her like ivy seeking a wall. And though his chest tightened with something he could not name, he did not interrupt. One evening, Edward returned from a long day at Hayes Capital. Meetings, contracts, negotiations, they all seemed to dissolve the moment he stepped through his front door. He found Clara and Isabella curled on the sofa, a children's book open on Isabella's lap. Clara was whispering halting words, her tiny voice working through each syllable with effort. "Once upon a time." Isabella beamed. "Perfect." Again. Edward's throat caught. He lingered in the doorway, unseen. Clara had not spoken a full sentence in nearly a year. Now, here she was, her voice shaky but rising, woven with Isabella's encouragement. When Clara noticed her father at last, she leaped up, holding the book. "Daddy!" she exclaimed, her voice loud enough to echo across the marble floor. Edward froze. The word rang like a bell. He hadn't heard it with such clarity in so long that it seemed almost foreign. Slowly, he walked over and sank onto the sofa. Clara climbed into his lap, thrusting the book into his hands. "Read with me," she whispered. He swallowed hard and began. His voice cracked at first, but Isabella joined, her tone smooth and warm. Together they read until Clara drifted into sleep against his chest, her breath steady, her small hand clutching his shirt. For the first time in years, Edward did not feel like a man carrying grief alone. He felt like a father. Days passed, and Clara began to draw pictures obsessively. Her crayons left bright trails of family: a tall man in a suit, a little girl with a rabbit, and a young woman with long, dark hair. Always 3 figures, never 2. Edward found the drawings scattered across the house, taped to her bedroom wall, tucked under the piano lid, slipped into his briefcase by small, mischievous hands. One evening, after tucking Clara into bed, Edward lingered by Isabella in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, sleeves rolled up, hair loose from its usual braid. There was soap on her cheek, and she laughed softly when she noticed him staring. "She draws you too, you know," Edward said, his voice rough. Isabella froze. "Me?" He nodded. "She sees you as part of us." Isabella looked down, her hands trembling in the water. "She calls me her sister. That's all I could ever be." Edward hesitated. He stepped closer. "Perhaps you don't realize. You've been more than that for her." His gaze softened. "For me, too." The air thickened. Isabella's breath caught. But before either could say more, Clara's sleepy voice called from upstairs. "Daddy! Music!" The moment slipped away like sand through fingers. The next afternoon, Clara had a small outburst. Edward found her in the drawing room, face streaked with tears, hands slamming the piano keys in frustration. Isabella knelt beside her, whispering gently, "It's all right, Clara. Mistakes make music, too." But Clara only cried harder, pointing to the sheet music. "Can't! Can't!" Edward entered slowly. He crouched by his daughter, laying a hand on her trembling shoulder. "Clara, listen!" His voice shook. "I don't care if you never play perfectly. I just want to hear you. Do you understand? Just you." Clara blinked up at him, startled. Her sobs slowed. She sniffled, then placed her tiny hand on his, nodding once. Edward exhaled shakily. For months, he had believed he needed to protect her from pain, shield her from disappointment. But tonight, he realized she didn't need protection. She needed permission to be herself. Isabella's eyes shimmered. She had never heard Edward speak with such vulnerability, and in that instant, she saw not a CEO, not a millionaire, but a man struggling to become the father his daughter deserved. One weekend evening, Edward arranged something unusual. Instead of hosting a business dinner, he canceled every appointment and ordered the dining room set for 3. Roe raised an eyebrow, but obeyed. When Isabella entered, confused, Edward gestured to the table. "Sit," he said gently. Her eyes widened. "Sir, I couldn't—" "You will," Edward interrupted. So Isabella sat, nervously smoothing her simple dress. Clara clapped her hands, delighted. "Family dinner," she announced, her voice bright. Edward's chest tightened. He raised his glass of water as if it were champagne. "To family," he said simply. Isabella's eyes brimmed, but she whispered, "To family." For the rest of the evening, they laughed over Clara's jokes, her clumsy attempts to cut bread, her sudden insistence on teaching her father the scales she had learned. For the first time, the dining hall, once echoing with emptiness, was filled with warmth. Later that night, as Isabella tucked Clara in, Edward lingered at the doorway. Clara was already half asleep, but her little voice murmured, "Daddy, sister, home." Edward's chest ached. After Isabella kissed the girl's forehead, she turned toward him. He lowered his voice, almost afraid of his own words. "Clara already has a mother," he said, "but perhaps she doesn't realize. She has found another." Isabella's breath caught. She stared at him, tears brimming, then quickly looked away. Edward didn't push. He knew some truths didn't need to be spoken outright. Some families were formed not by titles, but by the bonds of love that defied explanation. And in that quiet moment, as the mansion settled into sleep, the 3 of them, without saying it, had already become a family. The invitation arrived on a golden embossed card, slipped discreetly into Edward's morning post. It was from the Manhattan Children's Music Society, announcing its annual recital for young performers. Clara's music teacher at her private school had nominated her to play. Edward held the card in silence at the breakfast table. He watched Clara chase blueberries around her plate, rabbit tucked under her arm as always. She was humming, soft, tuneless, but it filled the air with a kind of brightness. When Isabella entered the dining room, Edward handed her the card. "They want her to perform," he said simply. Isabella read the elegant script. Her eyes widened. "A recital at Lincoln Center." Clara froze mid-bite, glancing nervously between them. She understood more than they often assumed. Edward frowned, concerned. She isn't ready. She's barely begun to find her voice again. But Isabella leaned close to Clara, smoothing a stray curl from her face. "Sweetheart, would you like to try? Just try?" Clara whispered, barely audible. "Yes." The weeks that followed were a blur of practice. Isabella guided Clara through scales, coaxed her through mistakes, celebrated each small triumph. The mansion once more thrummed with sound, not the polished brilliance of Margaret Hayes, but the raw, unsteady beauty of a child finding her place in the world. Edward sat often in the drawing room, watching quietly. His chest tightened each time Clara faltered, and Isabella caught her with gentle encouragement. It was not only his daughter learning to stand again, it was himself. But as the recital drew near, Clara's anxiety grew. She clung tighter to Isabella, sometimes bursting into tears when a passage went wrong. "You don't have to be perfect," Isabella told her one night, holding the girl close. "Music isn't about perfection. It's about giving people your heart." Clara sniffled, whispering, "Will Mommy hear me?" The question pierced Edward like a blade. He turned away quickly, but Isabella answered softly, "Yes, Clara. She'll hear every note." The night of the recital arrived crisp and clear. Lincoln Center glowed with golden light, its glass facade reflecting the hum of Manhattan's evening traffic. Inside, the audience gathered, wealthy patrons in evening gowns, parents with cameras, teachers whispering encouragement. Backstage, Clara trembled in her small white dress, rabbit-clutched tightly. Edward knelt before her, straightening her bow with clumsy fingers. "You'll do fine," he murmured. "Just remember what Isabella taught you." Clara nodded, but her lips quivered. "Daddy, scared." Edward pulled her into his arms. "So am I," he admitted. "But I'll be right there." When Clara stepped onto the stage, the lights seemed enormous, blinding. She sat at the grand piano, feet barely touching the pedals. The audience quieted. Her fingers hovered. The first note came out sharp, hesitant. She faltered, heart pounding, and for a terrifying second she nearly slid off the bench. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Backstage, Isabella's chest tightened. Edward gripped the armrest, half rising from his seat. Then Clara looked toward the wings. Her eyes locked on Isabella. The young woman stepped forward, heart racing. She shook her head at the stage manager's protests and walked into the light. She sat beside Clara on the bench, whispering, "We'll play together, just like at home." Clara's breathing steadied. She placed her tiny hand on Isabella's. Together, they began the lullaby Margaret had once written. The hall transformed. The hesitant notes blossomed into a duet, fragile yet radiant. The child and the maid, two souls carrying a legacy of music and loss, filled the vast space with something purer than perfection. Truth. By the final chord, the audience rose as one. Applause thundered. Clara gasped, covering her ears at first, then smiling through tears. She turned and wrapped her arms around Isabella. From the second row, Edward rose too. His chest swelled, pride and grief mingling in equal measure. He saw not only his daughter shining, but Isabella as well, recognized, celebrated, no longer invisible. After the performance, reporters swarmed the lobby, eager to capture the story of the silent child who had found her voice. But just as many microphones turned to Isabella. "Who are you?" they asked. "Are you her teacher? Her mother?" Isabella flushed, stammering, I'm only—" But Clara clung to her waist, looking up with fierce clarity. "She's my sister." Laughter and soft applause rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Isabella blinked back tears. For so long she had been unseen, a shadow in wealthy houses, a maid whose name no one cared to remember. Tonight, she was standing under lights, her music heard, her role undeniable. Edward stepped forward, placing a protective arm around both of them. "This," he told the reporters firmly, "is our family." For once, he did not care what society thought. Later, when the noise had died down, the three of them returned home. Clara fell asleep almost instantly, rabbit tucked under her chin. Edward lingered in the drawing room with Isabella, silence stretching between them. Finally, he spoke. "You gave her back her voice. You gave me back my daughter. And tonight, you gave the world a piece of yourself." Isabella lowered her gaze, her cheeks flushed. "It wasn't me. It was her." Edward shook his head. "No, it was both of you, together." Their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. Acknowledgement, gratitude, the fragile beginnings of something more. And though no vows were spoken, no titles assigned, the gift of recognition had been given. Isabella was no longer simply the maid. She was family. The rain that had washed Manhattan the night before left the city glistening under a pale September sun. East 72nd Street carried its usual rhythm of honking cabs and hurried steps, but inside the Hayes Capital headquarters on Park Avenue, the atmosphere was anything but ordinary. Edward Hayes stepped out of the black town car with his leather briefcase in hand, his expression unreadable. His daughter's recital was only days away, yet his mind was consumed by another storm, one that didn't come from nature, but from men in suits who believed they could dictate the boundaries of family. The glass doors of the skyscraper opened to swallow him whole. The marble lobby gleamed with cold precision, reflecting the sterile ethos of corporate power. Assistants scurried with files, investors waited with practiced smiles, but Edward barely registered any of it. He moved straight toward the top floor where the boardroom awaited, a chamber that had seen countless billion-dollar decisions, yet today would hold one far more personal. Inside, 12 men and women sat around the long mahogany table, their postures stiff, their eyes sharp. At the head of the table, Edward took his place. Beside him sat Marcus Levine, his oldest ally, though even Marcus's brow was furrowed with unease. The chairman of the board cleared his throat. "Edward, thank you for coming on such short notice. We have pressing concerns." Edward leaned back, folding his hands. "Go on." A woman in a charcoal suit slid a newspaper across the table. The headline, in bold letters, screamed, "CEO's daughter finds voice through Maid's piano lessons." Beneath it, a grainy photograph showed Clara clinging to Isabella's side after the Lincoln Center rehearsals, rabbit doll pressed against her chest. Another director spoke, his tone clipped. "It's admirable, Edward, what you've done for your daughter. But the optics, well, they're problematic." "Problematic?" Edward's voice was quiet, but his eyes flashed. "Yes," the man continued, emboldened. "This company deals with international partners, sovereign wealth funds, Wall Street titans. Appearances matter. When the press paints a picture of your household revolving around a maid from the Bronx, it diminishes the image of stability we've built." "Stability?" Edward repeated slowly, tasting the word as if it were poisoned. Another voice joined, older and colder. "Let me be blunt, Edward. We've all tolerated your retreat after Margaret's passing, but the company cannot weather scandal. We urge you to reconsider the visibility of this arrangement. Send the girl to boarding school, perhaps. Reassign the maid to less public duties. Maintain distance." The words hung like smoke in the air. Edward's jaw tightened. Images flooded his mind. Clara's trembling hands on piano keys, her whisper of "Daddy," Isabella's steady presence through storms, both literal and figurative. Distance? He thought bitterly. Distance was death for his daughter. Marcus spoke cautiously. Edward, they're not questioning your parenting. They're questioning how it reflects on Hayes Capital. But the director-in-Navy leaned forward, voice sharpened. If you wish to protect your position here, you must act. Sentiment cannot override stewardship of this empire. Edward's pulse thundered. For months he had rebuilt his life one fragile piece at a time, guided by the music Isabella coaxed from silence. And now these men who had never wept beside a fevered child, presumed to dictate whom his daughter could love, whom his home could embrace. He stood abruptly, palms flat against the polished table. The sound cracked through the room. You speak of stewardship as though it begins and ends with numbers. But I tell you this, my stewardship begins with my daughter. Without her, none of this matters. Murmurs rose, disbelieving. One man scoffed. Edward, we're talking about the reputation of Hayes Capital. No, Edward cut him off, his voice rising, resonant. You're talking about the reputation of men too afraid to be human. Isabella Morales is not a liability. She is the reason my daughter smiles again, the reason she speaks, the reason my home has not collapsed into ruin. The room fell into stunned silence. Edward's gaze swept across the board, each word deliberate. If any of you believe I will cast her aside to appease your prejudice, you are mistaken. I will not trade flesh and blood for polished headlines. I will not abandon the woman who saved my family. One of the older directors narrowed his eyes. So you are willing to jeopardize your company for a maid? Edward leaned closer, his voice like steel. She is not a maid. She is family. The declaration thundered louder than any quarterly report. Marcus exhaled softly, pride flickering in his eyes. But others shifted uneasily, whispering to each other. The storm had broken. After the meeting, Edward stood by the tall windows overlooking Park Avenue. The city sprawled below, indifferent to the wars waged in its towers. He felt Marcus's presence beside him. You know they'll push back harder now, Marcus said quietly. Edward nodded. Let them. I've fought markets and governments. This time I fight for something worth more than every dollar we've ever made. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Marcus smiled faintly. Margaret would be proud. She always said the world wasn't changed in boardrooms. It was changed in living rooms, in homes, in families. Edward's throat tightened. She was right. That evening, when Edward returned to the mansion, Clara came running, rabbit in hand. Daddy! She cried, her voice bright. She tugged his sleeve toward the drawing room, where Isabella waited at the piano. He paused, watching them together. The maid who was no longer a maid, the daughter who was no longer silent. Isabella looked up, sensing the weight in his eyes. Long day? She asked, gently. Edward crossed the room. The longest, but also the clearest. She frowned. What do you mean? He sank into the chair beside them, his voice rough but certain. Today they asked me to choose between reputation and family, between what the world expects and what my heart knows. I chose you, both of you. Isabella's breath caught. Her hand hovered over the keys. Trembling. Edward. But Clara interrupted, climbing into his lap, giggling softly. She pressed his hands onto the keys. Play, she demanded. Edward laughed, the sound breaking like sunlight through clouds. He struck a hesitant chord. Isabella joined, filling the silence with harmony. Clara added her small notes, uneven but joyful. And together, in that moment, they created music stronger than any boardroom decree. Morning came like a held breath. The September light over Manhattan was clean and thin, and the city's noise felt oddly muffled to Edward, as if even the cabs understood a threshold was near. The boardroom storm still rattled inside him, but its aftershocks had clarified something finer than resolve. He was no longer a man walking toward an event. He was a father walking toward a vow. Clara padded into the kitchen in her stocking feet, rabbit tucked beneath one arm, white dress wrinkled from hugging it in her sleep. Isabella's hands were already at work, smoothing the sash, braiding the stray curl that never obeyed. "Breathe," she told the little girl, tying a blue ribbon with a tug that was more blessing than not. "And remember, you're not playing for everyone. You're playing for one person." "Who?" Clara asked, voice barely above the kettle's sigh. "Whoever needs the song most," Isabella said, looking at both of them. The car slid up Broadway. By the time they turned past the Time Warner Center and crossed Columbus Circle, the nerves in the back seat had become a living thing. Edward reached for Clara's hand. It was damp, small, fierce. Isabella hummed the opening bars of the lullaby they'd braided from Margaret's notebook and Clara's stubborn little melody. It wasn't complicated, but it was true, like a window opening on a house that had forgotten air. The fountain at Josie Robertson Plaza leapt into the sunlight as they pulled up to Lincoln Center. David Geffen Hall gleamed, all glass and promise. Reporters clustered by the steps. Parents in black coats shepherded children in glittering shoes. Edward felt Isabella flinch at the cameras. He shifted, so she stood between him and Clara, a quiet geometry that said without words, "Here is our center." "Mr. Hayes!" a voice called, warm enough to pass for friendly. Harold Bennett, one of the board's colder weather systems, lifted a hand in neutral greeting. He wasn't alone. Two other directors hovered a respectful distance behind him, their smiles pressed thin. "Harold," Edward said. "This is my daughter Clara, and Isabella." No last names, no modifiers, no shrinking. Bennett's eyes flicked to Isabella for a fraction too long. "A big night," he said. "We're all rooting for you, young lady." To Edward, his voice lowered. "We can speak Monday. The markets prefer calm." "Let them listen tonight," Edward answered. "Calm can wait." Backstage was a hive. Tuners with graphite pencils and velvet cloths drifted past small hands practicing scales in the air. A stage manager, headset cocked, checked names with efficient taps. "Clara Hayes?" she called. "Here," Isabella answered, and the woman's eyes moved up and down in a single scan that landed on the maid's neat dress and sensible shoes. "Parents can wait in the green room," the stage manager said. "No coaches on stage during performance. No exceptions." "She isn't my coach," Clara whispered, suddenly clutching Isabella's sleeve. "She's my—" "It's all right," Isabella cut in gently. "We know the rules." She knelt until the hem of her dress pooled at Clara's ankles. "We practiced the first 4 bars with your eyes closed. Try that if the lights are too big. Remember where middle C is. And if your hands shake, let them. They'll settle when the song finds you." Clara nodded, swallowing hard. A volunteer pinned a paper number on her shoulder. Isabella's fingers ghosted over it as if pinning courage beneath it, too. "5 minutes," the stage manager called. Clara glanced at her rabbit. Can Bunny wait in your bag?" "Bunny will guard the bag with his life," Isabella promised, kissing the stuffed ear and tucking it beside Margaret's worn sheet. Edward crouched to eye level. "You can play at home and we'll still celebrate," he said. "There's no failing here." Clara's mouth trembled. "I want to play for Mommy." Edward's throat closed. Margaret's name had become a glass bell in the house, touched rarely, ringing long. "Then that's what you'll do," he said. "For both your mothers." The house lights faded. The program's earlier numbers went by in a blur of bright small talent. A Suzuki march, A shy cello, a stern little Chopin. Edward heard none of it, only the distant tempo of his own blood. He sensed Isabella beside him, leaning forward, palms flat against her knees as if keeping the earth from tilting. "Next," the MC said, "please welcome Clara Hayes." The applause was light and curious. Clara stepped out into the glow, a thin white line of a girl against the concert grand. The hall was larger than any room she had ever seen. 1,000 faces rising and falling in shadow like a quiet sea. She sat, feet not reaching the pedals, and placed her fingers where Isabella had taught them to fall. The first note came sharp with fear. The second was better. On the third, she heard someone cough, then a rustle, and suddenly the lights were not lights, but heat. The keys weren't keys, but teeth. Her fingers contracted. The melody she knew vanished like a fish at the surface. A murmur trickled through the hall. Backstage, Isabella's hand closed around the rabbit in her bag until the stitches creaked. "Look at middle C," she whispered to no one. Clara's chest rose too quickly. Her eyes slid to the wings, to the dark shape that was Isabella's outline, to the row where her father's face gleamed like a coin in a fountain. The stage manager's headset flashed. She shook her head slightly. A warning. "Do not move." Isabella stood. "Ma'am," the stage manager hissed, stepping in front of her. "Those are the rules." "Some rules keep children safe," Isabella said softly. "Some keep them silent." She did not push past. She pressed the rabbit into the woman's hands instead. "Please," she whispered, "just give this to her." The stage manager hesitated. Then, an old memory braided itself with the present, a niece who had quit violin because no one held her through the first fright. The woman exhaled. She slipped to the opposite wing, crouched, and slid the rabbit to the edge of the bench. Clara saw the worn ear and reached, hiccuping a breath that sounded like a sob turning into a laugh. She pressed the rabbit to her chest, then set it beside the fallboard. With 2 fingers, she found middle C. She closed her eyes. In the dark, Isabella lifted her chin and began to breathe with her. The first bar came like a prayer, 1, 2, 3, 4. The second bar followed it home. At the third, her small wrist faltered, and then, a second pair of hands, lighter than sound itself, entered from memory and sat beside hers. In row G, a child gasped, "Someone's playing with her!" Parents shushed without meaning to. Even that small dissonance turned into part of the music's argument with fear. Edward rose before he knew he had risen. A reporter near the aisle tipped his phone to capture the angle that would become a headline. Bennett, 2 rows back, leaned forward. Lips parted to shape an objection. Edward did not speak to the audience. He spoke toward the stage, each word pitched to reach the small white dress and the woman in the wings who had taught it how to breathe. "Play," he said, not commanding but confessing. "We are here." Clara's eyes opened. She lifted her head, not to the crowd but to the hall itself, as if the room were a woman bending to listen. She slid her left hand to anchor the low notes Isabella had drilled into her bones. Hold, hold, let go. Her right hand found the thread of Margaret's lullaby. Isabella had stitched it into Clara's melody so gently that it could be pulled taut without breaking. The 2 lines met and became one. Isabella did not step on stage. She didn't need to. She stood at the wing with both hands spread, as if holding the air steady. Her body made the shape of accompaniment while Clara made the sound. The child's shoulders settled. Her small back straightened as if a palm had pressed it kindly between the blades. The hall changed. People who had come to witness children learned to listen to a house reclaiming its own language. The last phrase, Margaret's phrase, rose, and Clara gave it a gift no one asked for. She held the note a heartbeat longer than fear would have allowed. the length of time it takes to decide in favor of love. Then silence, then thunder. The ovation startled her. Her hands flew to her ears, and Isabella laughed a wet, shocked laugh in the wings. The stage manager smiled without permission. Edward clapped until his palms stung. Beside him, Bennett's hands joined, polite at first, then louder. One more man dragged by music where reason would not take him. Clara stood and bowed, the rabbit tucked in the crook of her elbow. She did not leave the bench. Instead, she turned toward the bright where she knew Isabella was and said into the microphone the hall had not expected to be used by a child. This was for my moms. A hush fell that felt like prayer getting its way. Backstage, once the curtain dipped, the flood came. Children hugged her. Teachers bent and praised. The stage manager crouched to fix a slipping shoe and whispered, "I had a girl once who needed an ear like that." Isabella gathered Clara to her, kissed the damp hair without worrying about pins. Edward reached them, and for a tangle of seconds, there was nothing but the feel of each other. Then the lobby, bright, clamoring, the fountain's white noise folding into it like breath into speech. Cameras angled, microphones rose like flowers that open only at night. A woman with a glossy press badge stepped forward. "Mr. Hayes, congratulations. One question. Was it appropriate to let a domestic employee take such an intimate role in your daughter's development?" Edward didn't blink. "Appropriate? It saved my child. So yes." "Are you concerned?" Another voice pressed. "About what this says to shareholders?" Isabella stiffened. Edward slid an arm around both of them and pivoted so the microphones faced all three. "Here is what it says to everyone," he said. "Families don't come pre-labeled. The finest thing this city has ever built is not in these marble halls. It's in the homes where people choose each other when no one is looking. My wife Margaret gave Clara her first song. Isabella gave it back. For that, she has my respect, and my name if she wants it. But she doesn't need my name to have our place." A sound moved through the crowd, half gasp, half joy. A young father lowered his phone, suddenly tender with the thought of who tucked his kids in. A critic lifted his chin, sharpened to write something larger than a review. Bennett approached then, offering a hand. Up close, his face looked less made of stone. "You made a speech without making a speech," he said wryly. "Our PR team will thank you. And your daughter was extraordinary." "Our daughter," Edward corrected without thinking. Bennett's mouth tugged sideways, not quite a smile. "Monday, then," he said, but his voice lacked its old iron. "Bring your music." The crowd thinned. The three of them stepped out into the plaza, where the fountain arced in choreographed white. The night had fallen without anyone noticing. The city kept going, as it always did, but a circle of quiet opened around them the way circles open around a candle in a dark church. Clara reached into the program and produced a bent, penciled page, her own wobbling notation over the clean staff. "For you," she said to Isabella, "so you don't ever stop playing." Isabella took it as if it were made of breath. "I stopped once," she said, voice thick. "Never again." Edward drew them close and, for a moment, saw the whole road behind them. The mansion's heavy curtains, the storm that had stripped the fear from his house, the way a rabbit on a piano bench could out-argue a rule-book. "What now?" Isabella asked, not afraid of the answer. "Home," he said. "We go home." They did not hurry. They let the plaza's stones remember the weight of their feet. In the car, Clara fell asleep with the rabbit between them, fingers still curled as if holding a note that had finally finished ringing. Isabella's shoulder touched his. She did not move away. The city blurred, and beneath it the old river of grief moved too, but quietly now, like a thing that had remembered its banks. When they reached East 72nd Street, the mansion didn't look like a mausoleum. It looked like a house waiting for an evening. Edward carried Clara upstairs and laid her down without waking her. He returned to the drawing room where Isabella had set the program on the piano. The blue ribbon was still tied to its corner. "Will they punish you for tonight?" she asked, not trembling, just asking the world to say who it intended to be. "They already tried," he said, "and I answered." He touched the keys, not to play, but to say hello. It was habit now, like kissing a forehead on his way out of a room. Isabella slid onto the bench beside him and placed Clara's penciled page on the rack. He did not know the notes. He did not need to. "Again?" he said. "Again," she answered. They began with middle C, because you always begin with the thing that tells you where you are. Then they let the melody find them, and when it did, the house, their house, recognized it and smiled the way houses do, with the softest light, with the sound of floorboards accepting weight, with the almost inaudible click of a latch inside a door surrendering to a hand. Outside, a siren slid down the avenue like a violin learning to be a human voice. Inside, a family practiced the older art, saying what needed saying without words. It was not perfect. It was music. Years later, the night belonged to Clara. The New York Philharmonic's Grand Hall glimmered under chandeliers, the seats filled with patrons in evening gowns and tuxedos, students with eager notebooks, and parents clutching programs like treasure maps. A hush fell as the announcer's voice echoed across the hall. "Please welcome Clara Hayes, valedictorian of Juilliard, and the inheritor of a legacy both musical and deeply human." Thunderous applause rose as a young woman in a flowing gown stepped into the spotlight. Her dark hair was pulled back, her posture tall and steady, but her eyes, bright, steady blue, still carried the innocence of the child who once sat silent in a mansion's drawing room. She sat at the piano. For a moment she closed her eyes. In her mind she saw them all, her mother, Margaret's tender hands, Isabella's patient smile, her father's quiet tears. Then she touched the keys, and the hall filled with music. It was a symphony she herself had written, woven of every melody she had ever known. Margaret's haunting composition threaded through its heart. Isabella's lullabies wrapped around it like warm arms, and Clara's own voice rose above them all, strong, clear, alive. In the second row, Edward Hayes sat with Isabella. His once stern face had softened with time, silver streaking his temples, his eyes glistening with pride. Isabella's hand rested in his, their fingers interlaced, their bond now as natural as breath. They listened, not as spectators, but as family. Backstage, earlier that evening, Clara had paused before the mirror. Isabella adjusted her necklace, smiling proudly. "You look like a woman who belongs here." Clara had shaken her head. "No, I look like someone who belongs to you, to both of you." Edward, standing in the doorway, had said softly, "And we belong to you." As the final movement thundered through the hall, Clara rose from the bench. She turned to the audience, bowing gracefully. Then, in a clear, ringing voice, she spoke words she had carried for years. "Music gave me more than a stage. It gave me a family. To my mother, Margaret, whose music began this story. To my father, Edward, who never stopped holding my hand. And to my mother, my second mother, Isabella Morales, who gave me back my voice." Gasps rippled through the hall, followed by applause so fierce it shook the rafters. Cameras flashed, but Edward and Isabella saw only her, their daughter, their legacy. Isabella's eyes brimmed with tears. She pressed Edward's hand tighter. "She called me her mother," she whispered, almost disbelieving. Edward leaned close, his voice thick. "Because that's what you've always been." When the curtain fell and the applause thundered on, Clara rushed into the wings. She threw herself into Isabella's arms first, holding her fiercely. "I told the world," she whispered, "because the world needed to know." Then she turned to Edward, who lifted her as though she were still 5 years old. He held her close, heart breaking with pride. "You've given us more than we ever dreamed," he said. Clara shook her head. "You gave me music. You gave me love. I only gave it back." That night, they returned not to the mansion of silence, but to a home filled with warmth. The grand piano in the drawing room was no longer a relic, but the heart of their family. Clara's awards rested on the mantel, but more precious still were the crayon drawings, yellowed with age, still taped to the walls, reminders of the girl who once drew her family into being. Isabella lit candles on the dining table. Edward poured glasses of wine. Clara played softly in the background, a melody that mixed past and present until they became one. At one point, Clara looked up from the keys and said simply, This is home." Edward crossed the room, laying a hand on her shoulder. Isabella stood beside them, smiling through tears. For a long, quiet moment, the three of them stood there, framed by the glow of lamplight, their shadows stretching together across the marble floor. It was no longer a mansion of silence. It was a symphony of home. Thank you, dear friends, for staying with us until the very end of this healing journey. If Clara's story and the symphony of love, grief, and family touched your heart, please consider subscribing so you never miss the next story that brings hope and light. Your presence here means the world. Until we meet again, may your own home always echo with love, like a gentle symphony.